Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Sunday, September 8th. Today is day 338 since October 7th. I wanted to start with a short reading from a devotion earlier this week that I did that I thought was very profound. This is from Francois Fenelon, and this is what he said. How rare it is to find a soul still enough to hear God speak. The slightest murmur of our vain desires or of a love fixed upon itself confounds all the words of the Spirit of God. Last Sunday, I talked about spiritual practices and what it means to move from apathy to advocacy. And today I wanted to spend a little bit more time talking about that same thing, apathetic. Why are we so apathetic to the Palestinian people? And I wanted to focus specifically less on apathy and more on why are we apathetic specifically to the suffering of the Palestinians. And may I just say, responding to the suffering and oppression of the Palestinian people, that does not mean that we shouldn't also be empathetic or acknowledge and legitimize the grief and trauma experienced by Jewish people and Israelis as a result of the horrors of the October 7th attacks or anti-Semitism. Condemning the horrors of October 7th does not in any way minimize our acknowledgement of the horrors or the oppression of Palestinians. And honestly, when I look at the scriptures and my understanding of God, I don't think that God differentiates when he shows compassion. Think about Jesus's words in the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 4, verses 43 through 45 say, "You've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven." Chapter 5, actually, all of that is from Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 to 45. You've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. And then the second part of verse 45 says, he causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Other translations say he, meaning God, causes the sun to rise on the good and the bad. He sends rain to fall on the just and the unjust. God does not differentiate on whom he shows compassion. The suffering of any mother who has lost a child is a trauma and a loss, and I believe God would comfort them, be they a mother from Gaza or a mother from Israel. But today I want to spend a few minutes specifically reflecting on why so many people, especially in the church, are apathetic to the suffering of the Palestinian people. I want to say thank you to Roseanne, who engages with me and prays alongside of me and so many others around the world. She's from South Africa, and she cries out for justice and healing and an end to the violence and a quest for the end of the suffering of the Palestinians. I want to thank her specifically because she responded to me after last week's reflection with some thoughts. And several of the points that are addressed here come directly from her exhortations in that conversation. So thank you, Roseanne. Why are so many people apathetic to the suffering of Palestinians? There's three primary categories I want to talk about today. One of the most obvious reasons that may come to mind is because of theology or for theological reasons. Some Christians are of the belief that the descendants of Abraham, Isaac and Ishmael, were either blessed or cursed. Isaac, the father of the Jewish nation, was chosen. Of course, he was the blood child of Abraham and Sarah. And many Christians believe, Jews are the chosen people of God. The scriptures teach that, and the children of Isaac are blessed. I don't dispute that Isaac was born of Sarah when she believed she was well beyond her childbearing years, that he was a blessing and a blessed child of God. But I do believe many of our churches today have a poor theology when it comes to their teachings on Ishmael. And many churches and Christians believe that Ishmael was cursed, that as a son of Abraham, he was not blessed. It's true that Sarah kicked Ishmael and his mother Hagar out of the house, but after that happened, what did the scriptures say, and how did God respond? In Genesis chapter 21, read the story where Hagar was in the wilderness, and she and Ishmael cried out to God, and the scriptures say that God responded, and he heard their cry. He said, "Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the child." God responded to Hagar and Ishmael in the wilderness, and he met their needs. There's an excellent book by a conservative theologian from Southern Theological Seminary whose name is Tony Malouf. He's since passed. The book's called Arabs in the Shadow of Israel. Malouf was an Old Testament theologian. He wrote a chapter also in my book that I edited, A Land Full of God, Christian Perspectives on the Holy Land, where he talks about the theological idea that of this whole story, that the children of Isaac are blessed, but the children of Ishmael were cursed. And he says, this is a false teaching. This is actually not true at all in the Hebrew scriptures. In fact, both of Abraham's children were blessed by God. And when we read in Genesis chapter 25 about Abraham's death, both of his children came together to bury their father. So this idea that these two brothers had enmity and, the children of Abraham would be in conflict, thus the descendants of Isaac, the Jews, and the descendants of Ishmael, the Arabs, would be in conflict for thousands of years. That's completely not true. So argues Tony Maloof. And so he argues that that's a false teaching of Scripture. I could say a lot more about that, but I wanted to raise a few other thoughts. Another theological assumption is rooted in the teaching of Christian Zionism, and it has to do with eschatology, the study of the end times, and the assumption that the Jewish people have to be restored to their historic homeland in order for Christ to be able to come again. The second coming of Christ has to be ushered in by the restoration of the Jewish people to their historic homeland. The precursor of this idea was the Restoration Movement, which was very active in the 19th century, the 1800s. And thus, when the Jewish Zionist movement started in the late 19th century and with the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, the Restoration Movement became increasingly popular. Christian Zionism increased, and conservative Christian fervor for Jewish restoration hit an all-time high in 1967 during the Six-Day War. A relatively young, primarily Jewish nation defeated its Arab neighbors, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, in only 6 days. Mostly conservative Christians viewed this military accomplishment in light of eschatological fervor. God must be on the side of Israel for Israel to have won that war so quickly. So they believed. And not only that, it seemed like the U.S. was going to hell in a handbasket. Liberalism was on the rise. And so conservative Christians with their cultural values, and family values, who esteemed conservative Christianity, viewed all of these happenings in the Middle East in light of the end times. And if that was not enough, the book, This Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey, closed the deal, selling millions of copies, promising the imminent return of Christ and the impending apocalypse, encouraging people to become believers in Jesus, lest they succumb to eternal damnation with, the apocalypse just around the corner. Palestinians, unfortunately, were a side story that just get in the way of what was necessary, Christian Zionists believing in order for Christ to come again. And thus, whatever means necessary, war, death, destruction, even today, more than 40,000 people being killed in Gaza, are just another sign the end times are near. And as there's this quest for eschatological fulfillment and the longing for Christ to return, that's just a consequence. Palestinians killed. Another component of Christian Zionist theology is the idea that only salvation matters. The only salvation that matters is the salvation of the soul. Earthly suffering is but temporary and a necessary condition of the world while the world groans in the waiting of the return of Christ. This theology is so devastatingly destructive, not only for the Palestinian people, but for the Christian Zionists who believe it, because it allows them to become complicit in supporting violence, death, and destruction of Arab peoples and of others. My second component that allows for people to be apathetic to the suffering of Palestinians is racism, xenophobia. This is defined as fear or hatred, dislike of the other, specifically people who might be from a different country or a different place, someone who's different from you, dissimilar. This past year, a young Palestinian teenager who I love very much spent the summer she spent the whole year in the United States, a year of high school. She was placed in a rural community in Montana at a school with less than 100 students. At the school, many of the students mocked her and made fun of her because she was Palestinian, which of course was made much worse after October 7th and the Hamas attacks. Students wouldn't touch her, and they said that they would get Palestinian cooties if they did. This was a somewhat benign example in the scheme of things, but imagine what this must have been like as a teenager, going through such an experience of isolation in a foreign country. At the heart of it, racism, and it's such a hard time of life as a teenager. When we look at Hollywood films throughout history in the United States, we see enemies that often parallel whatever was happening at the US at the time. Think about who enemies were during films during World War II. It was Germans or Japanese. During the Cold War era, who were the bad guys in Hollywood movies? It was the Russians. Who are the bad guys in the films today? Often Arabs or Palestinians. This is just one of the ways that xenophobia can express itself, let alone the fact that general racism against Palestinians as Arabs exists. Look at how the world responded when the 7 Central World Kitchen aid workers were killed in Gaza in April. Don't get me wrong, that was absolutely a travesty. But why was the world up in arms when 7 internationals were killed? And when almost literally 7,000 times that number of people have been killed in Gaza, there's not an uproar. Doesn't that say something about the value of Palestinian life? Something is wrong with this picture. Finally, the third main reason I would assert that people can be apathetic to the suffering of Palestinians is that we're not willing to pay the cost, the sacrifice of what it means to advocate on Palestinians' behalf. There is a sacrifice, a cost, when one stands up for Palestinians, a high cost, especially in the culture of the United States, where criticism of the state of Israel can come with a high price. You might be identified as anti-Semitic. Don't get me wrong, I ardently oppose anti-Semitism. And there have been horrific actions towards Jewish people in the US and around the world in past days and weeks and months, let alone years and throughout history. But we have to differentiate between legitimate criticism of the state of Israel and anti-Semitism. Think about the cost college students paid in the spring who were protesting what was happening in Gaza. Many of them got kicked out of campus. Many of them got expelled. Some of them were not even allowed to graduate. That's being willing to pay a price, a huge sacrifice. Their very futures will never be the same. What's it mean for us to be willing to sacrifice, to stand up against the suffering, the killing, the death of Palestinians in Gaza? The greatest price to stand up for what is right. It might mean losing money. It might mean going to prison, or even when it really comes down to it, it might even mean losing your life. Now, it's easy for me to sit behind a desk to write about justice. What does it cost me in all of this, right? Jesus said in John 15:13, greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for their friends. I say often, might God break our heart for the things that break the heart of God. I learned that through World Vision. Might God break our heart for the suffering and oppression of all people, Palestinians and Israelis, seeing each and every Palestinian also as an image bearer of God, Imago Dei. Might we be willing to learn, feel, give, act, work, go for the sake of the oppressed, the marginalized, and the suffering. But also not just for the sake, not because it makes us feel good, but also because our very souls are in need of saving. Might we not be apathetic to the suffering of the Palestinian people, but might we be willing to sacrifice, to say enough, enough death, enough violence, enough, not in my name, not with weapons that are made by my country, that are built with my tax dollars. The Palestinian people are image bearers of God. Their lives are a reflection of the goodness of God in his creation. May God save the people of Gaza. May God save us. May God save the Jewish people of Israel. And may God bring peace. In the name of Christ. Amen.